And we have our special guest, Eduardo Alvarez, is back by special request because a lot of you were asking about, hey, I know that he barely even touched on the whole thing about the confluence, the convergence of these three major items, the pandemic, the recession, and the social justice movement. So there was a lot of conversation, a lot of follow-up, a lot of questions about that. So without further ado, I would like to, again, introduce my good friend, Eduardo Alvarez. And I think you've got a little something special for us, don't you, Eduardo?
There's a little twist.
As always.
In the way we've been thinking about these three major issues.
Okay.
And which I think sort of bring together a lot of the issues we've been thinking about, those of us who are brand practitioners, people in business, people in different organizations, because the pandemic, the downturn, and the issue of racial justice has basically turned the world upside down.
Yes.
In some ways. But before I get into the details, I just wanted to take a minute and talk about something historical.
Okay. So you got another curveball for me, I guess.
Yes, you have two.
Uh-huh.
We'll figure out if we can do three.
All right.
When I sat down and thought about it after you and I exchanged texts about doing this segment, I thought, some of these things I have seen before. Of course, I have, the runway of 40 years in business. So I've seen 4 decades of what has been going on, and in some ways, we have been talking about these three issues in one way or another. We talk about the pandemic. We haven't had a pandemic in our lifetime like my grandparents did, with the Spanish flu in 1918. Right. But we've been through things like H1N1, and we prevented Ebola to getting into our shores. Right. And then, we sometimes forget, because now it's sort of, an illness in a different light, AIDS, mid-'80s to early 90s. There wasn't even a name for the illness.
Right.
People were dying 2 days after going to the hospital. It was total chaos.
Right.
That's where the famous Dr. Fauci first came, into the public consciousness, because he realized this was very serious and the government wasn't taking it seriously. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
It's so I mean, we have that, in terms of the pandemic and how to talk about it. And a number of corporations and a number of, especially consumer facing, had to change their messaging at the time to take that into account once people felt comfortable to talk about it in public. So that's number one. In terms of the economic downturn, I can't count the number of recessions or mini recessions I have seen in 40 years.
Right.
However, I do remember very vividly some of the international ones that could have collapsed, global trade, whether in South America or Asia. There was the internet bubble, everybody thinks the internet is, works very well. And, there's a whole debate right now on Wall Street whether companies are overvalued or not. We saw that in 1999, 2000, just before 9/11, that exacerbated that situation. And then, of course, the 2008 meltdown, which took another decade to recover from.
Right.
What this is going to mean, it's anybody's guess. Right. So it's really, and I remember very vividly from that era, of the internet bubble in 9/11, Citibank had released a very interesting campaign like a year before the internet bubble, and the tagline was "Live richly," and it was the richly that it's so it was a double entendre on words, money, not money, and so on. And I said to myself after 9/11, I said, I wonder what they're going to do, because it was a very powerful, and I was working at the time in one of the branding agencies specialized in financial services.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they very deftly took the campaign and turned it into non-monetary things.
Mm.
It was about family. It was about relaxation. It was about getting educated, so it was a very interesting pivot that worked very well for them. Others followed suit with more or less success.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in terms of the downturn. And then racial inequality. We've been talking about this for 200 years.
Right.
It's the 60s being a big part because of the civil rights movement and the legislation that was enacted, and that sort of spilled going forward. And I remember back in the early 90s facilitating all sorts of diversity workshops for different companies, banks, and nonprofit corporations. And then that sort of waned, and then there was another surge that came in 10 years later, more directed towards the Latino community. But it's always been there, sort of in the, it's sub-consciousness.
Right.
And and for the people who are watching, if you want to read something really interesting about the whole concept of equality, diversity, inclusion, this week's issue of Business Week, the Bloomberg Business Week, the print and the online edition, has the whole issue devoted to equality, and has some very powerful, it's examples and also a historical of what has happened. And the last thing I will say about equality that is connected to brand, again, a pivot. I remember probably when I was been a senior in high school or something like that, Coke came out with a big splash of advertising. And you probably remember, as a kid, there was the commercial that had the song "I'd Like to Buy the World," blank, and it was really written as "I'd like to buy the world a Coke," right. And had 30 young people from different countries, different races, different ethnic backgrounds singing in a mountaintop, and that is one of the pivotal messages in advertising ever done. Right. Both, it's in terms of the people in Coca-Cola and McCann Erickson, which is a highly respected ad agency. And when I looked back, I went into the web and looked for the commercial. It's still as valid today as it was then. And then I realized that it was 1971.
1971.
1971, that commercial was made.
Amazing.
So
the power of YouTube that you can find that.
Yes, it's all that to say, I mean, we have been here before. It's but the current upheaval, I think, feels different. It feels different because, as you said, the confluence of these three issues, the speed with which it hit us. Right. We're talking, it was 6 months ago, they declare lockdown here in New York.
Right.
And, and I didn't leave my apartment for weeks at a time.
Right.
And the global nature. Before, it used to be, the Mexican peso crisis, or, the Asian tigers, or something happened in Russia. All of a sudden, it's everybody. All of a sudden is in the same boat.
Right.
And that sort of weighs, I think, on on people's psyche, on people's psychology. And I think more than anything is the realization that what we're experiencing right now, is going to impact the way that we live and the brands that we live with for a very long time.
Absolutely.
This is nothing that's, does that make sense? It's a put it into that historical, context, and then bringing it to the reality of today.
Yeah.
So my reflection, and my analysis led me to then believe that, there's an emotional and behavioral changes that are happening right now. Not that need to happen, more will, but, it's as we were just, talking before the session, I was telling you that in New York, now restaurants can be open for 25% of the pre-COVID client base they had, but people are not going. People are still afraid to go inside a restaurant. So they prefer to eat outside. That was fine during the spring and the summer and the fall. Come November, what is going to happen? So they're trying to figure out, do we reconfigure? Do we create these bubbles? We have heaters. What kind of heaters? What is the risk? It's the liability. So a whole new set of issues. So obviously the restaurants are marketing to their clientele in a different way.
Absolutely.
To try and bring them back. The other thing is people got used to cooking at home. More than ever. We've gone from a consumer society that loved going to restaurants where they're very high end, if you have the means, or mass market, and all of a sudden that does not exist. So the emotional behavior changes, I think, and this is the other curveball I was going to throw to you. It affects 3 areas of how we live. That are radically changing. And I came to that realization looking at initial data in terms of consumers, looking at surveys that are happening, listening to subject matter experts, watching what is going on in the world around us. And basically, there are 3 things that will change as we move forward and that are going to be influenced and informed by the pandemic, inequality, and the financial situation. And the first one is the world of work. The second is how we learn. And the third, the way we consume.
Of course.
So let me tell you a little bit about each one. Any questions?
No, I mean, there's no possible way that those 3 things could not be impacted. How we work, it's for years we've been talking about, working remotely is possible, it's capable, but everyone said, no, it could never be sustainable. It could never, ever happen. Companies would go under. There's a lot of proof that the work from home, people, in some instances are more productive, and in some, at other times, like maybe early Monday morning or late Friday afternoon, which is not too different than even whenever they were at the office, but there's some productivity slacking, in those times. But, how we learn, I think, is probably something that is more of a shift. People have been doing online learning for quite some time. I mean, half of what I did in my adult degree program was, via online classes. But that was more of a choice to accelerate the velocity of which I attained that degree, instead of just the only way that I could do my education, right? And then, the way that we consume, I'm pretty sure Jeff Bezos is pretty happy with the platform that he has in place, and how sustainable and how rock solid it is to have been able to to tackle and embrace that entire shift that people had in March and April and June. So, and there were others that, you and I come in from an industry where we're teaching people and we're coaching people and making suggestions and recommendations for people to embrace technology, embrace disruption, to look for other ways, that omni-channel delivery of their services. We've been telling them about that for years and years and years. And now it came to that tipping point where, along with these other two things, if they did not have those ways of interacting with and providing their services and their expertise to their client base, they had a very rough go. And they're like, most of them are not around if they were not able to, with technology, do all of those things.
Absolutely. Let me tell you a little bit about each of the three and what the experts are saying. The world of work, and there I listened to a podcast not long ago by a guy by the name of William Arruda, who Cody would love this. William was one of the pioneers of personal branding.
Okay.
He's the go-to guy for personal branding. And he was talking about the world of work and how that's affected. Needless to say, the corporate flexibility impact. Twitter announced back in May that they don't need people in the offices.
Right.
It's the guy who's, running one of the major divisions moved to Hawaii. And he's got 25 people from around the world.
Right.
And he has got a huge screen where he can have the 25 people in his team interacting at the same time.
Right.
Which is interesting. The second is work-ready homes. We've all been, either cocooned in apartments and houses. You have two little girls and the wife, and it must be
little itty bitty space.
So the more we work at home, the more do we need printers? Do we need printers? What kind of equipment do we need? And most importantly, internet connection.
Yes.
There's an explosion of how that is going to change. As you just said, e-learning. But e-learning at every age and at every stage. And I learned a new word. I have to look it up, see if it's upskilling.
Upskilling. Yeah, absolutely.
That is one of the major things that people are looking at. The other one is how you dress, what we were just talking about. There is one of the big consulting firms that sent out a memo about dress for your day. If you're meeting with clients, whether it's virtual or in person, the tie, the suit, and if you're not, then it could be the t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops. It's what I said last time when I was a banker 20, 30 years ago. I had 10 suits, 12 shirts, 50 ties, etc. I don't think I have worn a suit or even a sports jacket since last December. That's the way. So it's a complete shift. And finally, one of the things is what he calls video virtuosos, which you and Cody are part of that class. And telling people to get comfortable with the medium because it is here to stay. We laugh about Zoom, we make jokes about Zoom, we curse Zoom, but Zoom is where things are. Right. So that alone is the world of work, and it's and all the other three, as a sort of influence how that is going to advance. How we learned, I think it's we touch upon school or not school. Do you send the kids? What is the risk reward factor in something like that? And then begs the question of the have and have nots, especially in places like New York or Chicago or LA, where you have whole neighborhoods of underprivileged kids that don't have the access to the technology.
Right.
How well do blended methods work? I'm sure you're dealing with that with the kids.
Right.
It's minimizing disruptions to social behaviors. I just heard a wonderful story from the wife of a friend who's a first grade teacher. And school was starting, and then we're going to do it in the classroom. Then there was an outbreak in the neighborhood, and it was canceled.
Yeah.
How do you reach a first grader through a screen? Well, this woman basically went around the neighborhood for 3 days and visited every home of every one of her first graders with a little bag with some supplies and the first lessons and there was she met them outside the house, social distancing with masks, introduced herself as Mrs. So-and-so, and I'm your first grade teacher. That's a lot of work.
A lot of work.
But that is very impressive. But how will that be integrated into what we do? And then, of course, the issue of the upskill and the continuous learning. And needless to say, how we learn has a lot to do, with how we interact with the world and we interact with, with the brands that we have. And the third one is the way we consume, which is the one that, affects, more directly the whole issue of branding and how brands interact with people. And McKinsey and Company, the big consulting firm, just did a global survey, and I found it very, very interesting in terms of, what are consumers thinking in the age of COVID. And they came up with 5 or 6 very interesting points. The first one and the most obvious one, the flight to online, is that was already happening for certain things. Now it's just an explosion. And they believe that once the consumer gets used to that, there's no going back.
Yes.
So that has major implications on how you put products and how you put your brand out there. The second thing they found is, which I found it very interesting, is what they call the shock to loyalty. So we're given that some basic brands, people are loyal to them. Well, people are living differently. People are spending more time at home. People have more time to look and consider. So they consider options.
Right.
And that means that brands that they had been using for 10 years, they are more willing to try something new. And that is one of the main things that, branding and marketing and communications, the companies that are at the forefront and that are thinking about this, are the ones that will succeed. Because at the end of the day, they also maintain that there are 3 things that consumers look for: availability, convenience, and value. And remember back at the beginning of the pandemic in March, the disinfectants, the toilet paper, it's the wipes, everything, and people were scrambling all over the place. And it was not in large cities like Chicago. It was also in the suburbs and in rural areas. Everyone was running around. The only disinfectant
anywhere.
Right. And the only disinfectants I could find were in the bodegas.
Right.
Because they stocked them because, once in a while somebody would come in at 10 p.m. and say, oh, the cleaning lady's coming tomorrow, or tomorrow's cleaning day, or whatever it is. And, so they had 3 or 4 bottles that sat there for years.
Right.
It's, so, I mean, it really is, it's interesting how, these dynamics. Obviously, the 4th thing they found is health and safety. And, it's and the advent of contactless, whether it's payments, whether it's going through a grocery, shop line. So, those things are, people have become much more aware, of health and safety. The story of the restaurants in New York that I just mentioned. And finally, the other thing that they found is that essential goods dominate the markets right now. I think we talked about that last time. How things that are necessary, and then we're giving the example of shampoo. Said they went and looked at Amazon, and they found that the sale of generic shampoo went up or has gone up, while the premium ones has gone down. So people, again, availability, value, and convenience.
Right.
But then people have become much more price conscious.
Yeah.
It's which is really very, very interesting. So as I looked at, these three categories, sort of overlaid over the three major issues, as I reflect up, what are the takeaways then?
Right.
What is happening? And obviously it's time to adjust business models.
Yeah.
And that is what is happening. And people who cannot adapt business models will, eventually fade. It's and with business models comes then, how do I take my brand to market? How do I communicate that brand to the market? And if you recall, last time we spent a fair amount of time talking about brand versus branding, and then what are the mechanics, the process of branding. It's and I am sure that we're going to start revisiting the traditional way that we have looked at brands, given the confluence of the three major problems we have, and then come up with a different solution.
Right.
So that adjustment is definitely in the cards. The other one, I take this from the McKinsey study, is prioritizing consumer segments. Remember how we used to tell our clients, the segmentation in financial services, and usually it stayed at the level of demographics. Everybody was running crazy about millennials a few years ago.
Right.
It's and they did about Gen X before, the boomers, and yeah, the demographics are still important. However, there's subcategories of demographics that are interesting. It's you have the boomers who are very comfortable and are retired and live on their income, and who are more adventurous, if you want, it's with their spending habits. While you have others who are on a fixed income who are less adventurous,
Right.
because they don't know if inflation is going to go up, or so you have to speak differently. It's Gen Zers apparently are more of the type that that's this is going to pass, and they can keep buying sneakers and it's and Bermuda shorts or whatever they buy, surfboards.
Right.
It's while you have then the whole intergenerational part of people who have lost jobs or who have been furloughed and have a family, and don't know what's going to happen 6 months from now. Right. So as you see, the segmentation has become more complex, and yet you have to have a view of the brand that can communicate, to those different segments. And I also think that then it's a time to, we talked last time, to adhere to authenticity in our branding strategies. It's and Cody said, gave a very good example of things that he has seen in the market, communications and brand campaigns, that they all say the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it's we do not subscribe to racial inequality, or whatever it is about COVID, or the the economic downturn. But you have to really find the core of that authenticity, and which is what's going to allow those brands to create a personal connection with the consumer, and a connection that is long lasting. It's and taking into account all the things that I've just mentioned in terms of now we live more inside our homes with our families, in some cases multi-generational families and that live together, all these things. So what I would say, in the end is, it's time to live by your values and by your brand values. We've talked about brand values. We've written about brand values. Now it's a matter of living through them. It's whether it's personal values, corporate values, or the confluence of those two, in the context of a very difficult societal situation brought about by COVID, the economic downturn, and the racial and ethnic inequality. So that was the curveball.
That's the curveball. That was a good curveball, I think. So is there one, in 30 seconds, we talked about a lot in 30 minutes, but Eduardo, how do we summarize it in 30 seconds? Here's my curveball to you. You've got the 3 impacts. You've got McKinsey's 5, major areas of influence that have come as a result of everything in the last 6 months. You've got kind of your 3 areas where you see that being fleshed out. In 30 seconds, can you give advice to brands on what they should do today? Like how do they start in 30 seconds?
How do they start? I think they starts about being themselves.
Yeah.
Not lying to themselves. And really, at the end of the day, after all this, we've been breaking down branding in different ways in terms of what is it, what are the mechanics, but at the end of the day, branding is about what you believe,
right?
And and that's where there's your personal brand, your corporate brand, and if you're working in that arena, your personal brand and your corporate brand need to mesh at some point, because you cannot really take something to the marketplace if you don't believe in it.
Right.
And believing it is also living it. So I mean that is always where I started. And remember that one of the things we used to do dealing with financial services companies, we'd have these ideations, and to get them to go big and then start coming down to what the core values, and the core issues were of their corporation or the credit unions, or whoever the client was. It was always down to the core, if you will. And if you believe, I think then you become successful at what you do.
Love it.
Does that answer your curveball question?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Well, Eduardo,
Great.
I want to thank you for not only accepting our first invitation, but another one to come and talk about with everything going on. We've got the social justice movement, we've got a pandemic that's on our hands, and we have a recession that kind of happened and then is still budding underneath. And there's still much work to be done to get us into, a more, I guess you would say, a more comfortable position where things are not happening on all fronts, but brands can't wait that long. Personal brands, corporate brands, they can't wait for things to be more comfortable to start making decisions. It has to be now. And I think what you just said was you have to live it, and it has to be something that's truly authentic. And so what you say and what you do have to match up. And so that's the first place where I think you can start, is what you're saying your corporate values are, is that fleshed out with real life action plans? Do you, if you say that you're benevolent and committed to the community, are you actually doing that? How is that brought into fruition? You know, looking at all of those different things. So I know that there's going to be an opportunity for us to talk more. I know that there's going to be an opportunity for us to look at some different things, and maybe it's towards the end of the year when we've got, you know, a full 9 months of looking at this. We're just now, it's day 1 of Q4. We'll see how everything looks towards the holidays. You know, it's going to be a very different fourth quarter than we're, you know, normally used to. So I'm excited to.
There's nothing normal anymore, Alex.
No, not anymore. So I appreciate your time, Eduardo. I appreciate all of you for coming and checking us out and investing time with us. We'll put a couple of those links that Eduardo had mentioned, the Bloomberg report. Eduardo will send that to me so I can put it in the comments, and then the McKinsey report so you guys can take a look at that. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to Eduardo, reach out to me, reach out to Cody. But that's a wrap for this edition of the ABC Chats podcast, part of the It Is What It Is series. All right, guys. Be well.
My pleasure. Take care.
Yeah.